What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Warden Bow build. So Wardens and Bow builds have had a long history ever since Wardens were first released about 2.5 years ago at this point, back in Morrowind. Bow builds were very popular among Warden mains. That was mainly because the Warden's Animal Companion's ability had a stamina spammable that you could use at range. So that opened the possibility of potentially running a Bow build on a Warden. And since then, Bow builds have kind of been used throughout the community, both in more casual play, in PvP, as well as endgame PvE content. Yes, Bow builds are used on occasion in endgame PvE content. So the advantage of running a Bow build is you allow yourself to play at a safer distance, or I should say a ranged distance, compared to running your traditional dual wield or two-handed build, but you are still gaining all the benefits of being a stamina DPS. So a lot of people, especially in the endgame community, have started to use Bow builds in place of magic DPS in certain situations where you want the slightly higher damage of a Bow build or the additional benefits of a stamina build without having to transition entirely over to a magicka build. So that's kind of where Bow builds stand right now. They're not what I would necessarily call the meta for every single piece of content, but for trials like Asylum, Cloud Rest, even in Sunspire, the downstairs portal groups for Navintas hard mode, those DPS are sometimes Bow builds because it allows them to play at range, be a little bit safer, a little bit more conservative with your gameplay, while not giving up too much DPS. Now, like most of our other build videos, we will not be going over any gear. Gear in this build will be covered in a separate Bow gear video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right around now. This particular video will be taking a look at skills and rotation. So let's go ahead and get started here with our skills. So on our front bar here, we are using a Master's Bow, so we do have poison injection here. We have lethal arrow, growing swarm, poison injection, bull netch, bird of prey, and wild guardian. Now the main two abilities we're going to be using are going to be poison injection and lethal arrow. While you could use growing swarm as a dot, you will end up taking a little bit of a drop in your sustain. You will be able to apply minor vulnerability, and you do get a little bit of cleave damage with growing swarm. So it is kind of an optional move to use here. Mainly the reason why we have all these abilities here is for the 2% additional damage done bonus with the advanced species passives. You can replace these with a fighter skilled ability, so any of these three abilities. So silver shards for more cleave, as a cleave spammable. Preservation for a heal and minor protection. Camouflaged hunter for the minor berserk when you crit on an enemy's flank. And barb trap, this would just be for the raw weapon damage, although you could use it potentially if you were able to get within melee range to get that minor force uptime. But with the advanced species passive, I got a little bit better DPS this way. Then on our back bar, this is the Maelstrom Bow bar. You have Soul Trap, Bull Netch again, Endless Hail, Bird of Prey, Channel Acceleration for the minor force, and then we have Wild Guardian again. So you do need to use Channeled Force in order to get your minor force. If you can't use Channel Acceleration, then you will want to use Lightweight Beast Trap for the minor force. Unless you can be within melee range, then you would just be able to use Barb Trap every 18 seconds or so. Definitely try to stick with Channel Acceleration if you can, just because it lasts longer, and also uses Magicka, so that opens up, basically gives you a little bit more sustain on this particular build. Again, Bird of Prey here is mostly for the minor berserk, so you don't have to be as reliant on your healers for the minor berserk bonus, but also the advanced species passive. Bull Netch is double barred here for the passive mainly, so it is double barred, so you can activate it on either bar here for additional stamina return. In terms of other abilities here, I found Lethal Arrow to give you the highest DPS. So your spamming Lethal Arrow will give you the highest DPS. However, if you want additional Major Fracture, like a Cleave Major Fracture, you can use Subterranean Assault as well. This is pretty useful. You can combine Subterranean Assault with Lethal Arrow if you'd like. So for example, you can put Subterranean Assault in place of Growing Swarm or Bull Netch on the front bar here. You'd be able to use Subterranean Assault and then 2 Lethal Arrows, Subterranean Assault, 2 Lethal Arrows that way. But you will end up seeing a drop in DPS if you decide to go that route. It's better just to use just straight up snipe, I should say lethal arrow. But Subterranean Assault does have the additional major fracture bonus, so it is useful in trash fights to kind of get that additional major fracture going in trash fights. Cutting Dive is another build I do want to mention here because it does cause a bleed whenever you hit enemies that are off balance. So if you're able to keep a good eye on your off balance timer, your off balance debuffs, you can use Cutting Dive here and get 7 stacks of this bleed when you use them on an off-balance enemy. It does require you to be a little bit cognizant of when your enemy is being set off-balance, but if you're able to do so, the bleed when it stacks up to 7 times can be quite strong. So in this instance, so for example, if you would use this in place of Bull Netch on the front bar, you would basically use this once you set off-balance 7 times, and then go back to lethal arrow spamming as your spammable. But beyond that, not too many other abilities here for a Warden. On the bow build, make sure to use Acid Spray for using the Blackrose Prison bow on the front bar rather than the Master's bow. This would be replacing Poison Injection here. If you need some additional mitigation, you will want to use Elude or Shuffle for the major evasion buff. This decreases damage from AoE attacks by 25%. A lot of damage coming from trials and dungeons do count, and they kind of fall under the AoE umbrella, so it actually does provide a decent amount of mitigation in PvE content. Moving on from there, make sure to have Shadow Silks unlocked, especially if you have a lot of bow DPS, just for the Spider Black Widow synergy. The synergy itself is not quite as strong as it used to be, so it has seen a few nerfs, but it's still essentially free DPS, and if you're running Lokkestiiz, then it will provide better major Slayer uptime from Lokkestiiz effect here, so definitely an ability you want to have on hand. Then as a self-heal, you should be using Echoing Vigor or Resolving Vigor here. I personally recommend Echoing Vigor just because it can stack with other Echoing Vigors. So if you have multiple Echoing Vigors going, you will usually be able to beat out Resolving Vigor's healing done per second. So definitely more beneficial to run the group utility morph than it is for the selfish morph here. Well, that concludes pretty much all the different skills here. Moving on to our rotation. The rotation is actually fairly simple, fairly straightforward. So I'm just going to put the dummy there for the 20-minute parse at the end. You can see here that we really only have 4 abilities, arguably 5 if you want to include Growing Swarm here. But we won't be using Growing Swarm because we will be wanting to use Lethal Arrow. But the rotation's pretty simple. So you always just want to start off with your Minor Force, so whether that's Challenge Acceleration or Lightweight Beast Trap. Get your Netch up for the sustain, and then use Hail, and then just lethal arrow spam the whole time. You can use Growing Swarm if you'd like, I mentioned this earlier. So Endless Hail and Soul Trap will always be used together. Just want to keep an eye on Poison Injection and use that when it runs out. And then you just want to make sure to re-up your Minor Force whenever it runs out there. And again, very simple rotation because a lot of it is just using Lethal Arrow. Just keeping an eye on Poison Injection and re-upping that when it starts to run out. Again, very simple rotation here. If you were using Subterranean Assault, you would instead be using Subterranean Assault, 2 Lethal Arrows, Subterranean Assault, 2 Lethal Arrows, Subterranean Assault, 2 Lethal Arrows, or Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities. So sometimes you will have Subterranean Assault, and then you would use Endless Hail, Soul Trap, Subterranean Assault, Poison Injection, Lethal Arrow, for example. But that's if you are using Subterranean Assault. So the pattern of Subterranean Assault is a little bit more tricky because it is Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities, Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities. But the pattern is still the same no matter what, and you should be trying to tie together Endless Hail and Soul Trap together. Yes, Endless Hail does have a 14-second duration, Soul Trap has a 10-second duration, so you will see a little bit of downtime on Soul Trap, but it's just a little bit easier to maintain those 2 abilities together, just to link those 2 together. Yes, it's going to be a slight DPS loss, but it'll ease up the rotation by quite a bit. So we'll do a 20 million parts so you guys get an idea of the DPS that we're able to pull. Just check that I have my Mundus. Okay. Now, the thing with bow builds is you want to be as far away as possible because of the passive under the bow line, long shots, which increases the damage dealt by bow abilities when you're at longer range. With this particular build, you will be able to stand up to 28 meters away because that is the farthest, the closest range, the minimum range here. So even if you're using Growing Swarm, that range is still 28 meters, so you still be able to stand within that range. Now, if you're running Subterranean Assault instead, then you will have to close that gap to 20 meters instead, just because that is Subterranean Assault range right there. So 20 meters versus 28 meters here. So we are going to be standing pretty much as far away as we possibly can, so that way we can get the most damage out of our lethal arrows. So to give you an idea of 28 meters, this is about 28 meters right now from the 21 million dummy here. So we'll just actually try to stand over here. The grass is in the way. Trying to find a good location where the grass is not in the way. Maybe we'll just, yeah, we'll just do it here. Alright, so we're just going to go ahead and get started here with the parse. It's a very simple rotation. I've demonstrated it earlier, so not much to talk about during the parse, but this will give you an idea of how much DPS that we're able to pull with a bow build. You're just going to also want to use your Wild Guardian ultimate on cooldown, so whenever it is up, you just want to use that. Re-up Channel Acceleration here. Remember, Channel Acceleration does have a cast time, so you're not going to want to cast it when it completely runs out. You'll want to cast it a little bit early, so that way you can anticipate that cast time. Same thing with Lethal Arrow too, there's a cast time associated with Lethal Arrows. You will not actually be able to use potions or your synergies while you're in that cast time for a Lethal Arrow. Just keep that in mind. You will need to time your potions to basically that moment when you're light attacking between lethal arrows. Now, in regards to what bar you use your ultimate on, because we are using 2 arena bows, our stats are pretty much the same across the board. I will say try to use it on your front bar because you do have 1 additional animal companions line on the front bar, so you do actually have a little bit more damage on your front bar because of that. So if you can, try to use it on your front bar. Make sure you're hitting your light attacks between each lethal arrow for the Hawkeye passive. Weaving in general is important, but it's more important for bow builds because of the passive, that Hawkeye passive that gives you a little bit of additional damage. You want to make sure you have 5 stacks pretty much the whole time. It's important you hit your light attacks between each of your abilities here. When you get into execute, nothing really changes because you don't really have an execute. Your bear does get some bonus damage when you get into 25% health or less, but it's not really as spammable as an ultimate, so not really what I would call an execute. Let's cast an Endless Hail and Soul Trap. There we have it. That is a Bow build with a Stamina Warden. We managed to pull 78.2k. So not going to be quite as strong as a magic DPS necessarily, but the rotation is a lot simpler. So kind of take it as you will. It also allows you to play dual wield two-hand Stamina Warden in those instances where you might not need the Bow builds. So for example, a lot of DPS in Sunspire, if they are the portal group for Navitas hard mode, they'll actually play a dual wield or two-hand build for the first two bosses, and then when they go down to the portal group, they actually swap to the Bow build, so that way they can play at range and not risk getting killed while fighting the Eternal Servants. So an example of where you would see Bow builds being used there would be in Vet Sunspire hard mode for certain stamina classes here. But you can see here, pretty simple, pretty easy rotation, and DPS is not that bad, especially when you compare it to magic DPS. Going to be a little bit lower, but not by too much, and it does open up that possibility, again, of running dual wield and two-hand on certain bosses, and Bow where in those fights where you need additional range. But that pretty much concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions at all about the build, feel free to ask them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.